Let's settle the compensation issue without using courts and tribunals.
Tonight, will the government machine follow the will of the minister when it comes to compensation for discrimination against First Nations children?
I'm calling upon the federal government to increase our funding in special ed to help these children in need.
Communities along the Wabigoon River system still suffering from mercury poisoning.
We have our budget in February. We'll know then what the actual quantum is.
And how BC plans to share revenue from gambling with First Nations. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Melissa Ridgen.
And I'm Dennis Ward. Today at the Assembly of First Nations gathering in Ottawa, the chiefs heard from the Indigenous Services Minister about plans to address the estimated 40,000 First Nations children locked into the child welfare system.
Minister Jane Philpott was taken to task for not practicing what she's preaching when it comes to compensating people let down by the system. Tom Fenaria leads off tonight.
The little ones. I wanted to focus my comments this morning on the issue of children and families.
During her half-hour address to the Assembly of First Nations, Indigenous Services Minister Jane Philpott emphasized fixing what she calls a humanitarian crisis. Among the solutions, legislation that would put the child welfare system into the hands of First Nations.
I believe that it can be a clarion call, a call across the nation to say no more. No more scooping First Nations children from their families and communities.
But Philpott's speech wasn't just met with applause. Some chiefs in attendance say Canada is still dragging its heels when it comes to making right decades of underfunding of Indigenous child services, particularly when it comes to paying compensation to children who are victims of this underfunding.
I understand that the talks broke down as of Friday, and the result communicated was that from Canada was to return to litigation. We can't go back to litigation on this. Minister, I'm asking for your intervention.
Minister Philpott's reply was adamant.
Let's settle the compensation issue without using courts and tribunals. That to me is the way to do it, to discuss directly the issue of compensation.
As the director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, Cindy Blackstock has led the 11-year fight to have Canada acknowledge that it discriminates against First Nations children by underfunding child welfare. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that the practice was discriminatory. Now Blackstock is working to get each child affected the maximum $40,000 in compensation, something she estimates will cost Canada $1.5 billion. And while Blackstock welcomes Minister Philpott's no litigation stance, she would rather see concrete action.
It's a bit confusing. I mean, what really matters to me is what they file in court, and what they filed with the tribunal so far is we want to litigate. And so I'll be looking forward to seeing the Minister instruct her council separately and see a new direction coming forward.
While it would appear that there is will to settle the compensation dispute, whether it will happen in the courts and how much each child will get remains unclear. Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Amnesty International calls it one of the worst, if not the worst, health crises in Canada. That's the effects of mercury poisoning suffered by the Grassy Narrows First Nation in Ontario. A new report was released today. At a press conference in Ottawa, the report's author said youth and children have been most affected through the consumption of mercury-tainted fish.
Have affected the children and are still affecting the children of Grassy Narrows who have more health problems than children and youth in other First Nations communities.
We have these children that have learning disabilities, and I'm calling upon the federal government to increase our funding in special ed to help these children in need, these children that need help with their education. In addition, I'm also calling upon the federal government to provide compensation for all the community members of Grassy Narrows right now.
Longtime Assembly of First Nations elder Elmer Corshane has passed on to the spirit world at the age of 82. Today at the AFN meeting in Ottawa, several tributes were given and a song was played in his honor. Here's some of what was said.
And I ask everybody in your own little way to say a prayer. You know, Elmer's on his way to make his journey home. But I'm going to tell you guys that when I walked into that hospital room on Wednesday morning, you know what I seen? I seen Elmer sitting there with a chief that traveled all the way from the Ontario region with a lawyer. And they were talking about land claims and how he can help with that land claim. And I remember walking into that room and I chuckled and I kind of shook my head and I looked at Elmer and I said, Elmer. And here's me thinking, you should be resting, you need to rest. And, meanwhile, that fight and that spirit and that true warrior, he gave his life to his people right to his very last breath. And it showed the days before his passing that his life's work, he worked right to the end for our people. I didn't want to see him suffer no more, and his work is done now. He's on his way to be with his ancestors and to be with his son who journeyed before him.
When you love someone, yes, you have to cry, and those tears come, and there's a time for grieving. But our elders back home say, not too long too, because when that spirit looks back and they see all the tears and the hurt and the pain, that loved one does not want to make his journey. So we say to our relatives to cry, and we know we have to get it out. It's hurt. But we say not too long, because we want that spirit to go in a good way.
Wishing a safe journey to Mr. Corshane. It's been an investigation that's been ongoing for 2 years, and now the Office of the Independent Police Review Director, which looks into police conduct in Ontario, says how the Thunder Bay Police Service polices Indigenous people will be made public next week.
The systemic review, the first of its kind for the province, examined Thunder Bay Police Service's policies, practices, and attitudes on missing persons and death investigations involving Indigenous people. First Nations leaders welcomed the review when it was announced 2 years ago. Wounds from the student inquest that examined the deaths of 7 First Nations students in the city were still fresh, along with strong concerns over how police handled some of those missing persons reports and death investigations. Anishinaabe Nation has declined to comment until the report is released next week. But this is what Annabette Achni-Peneshkam, who was Deputy Grand Chief at the time, said about the relationship with police when she was lobbying for an Indigenous seat on the Police Services Board in 2016.
There's a lot of things that are coming to the surface where there has been situations where our people have been mistreated, either verbally or physically. A lot of those allegations were proven to be true. And so that's why it's very important that we start addressing this and working together, and that our people, our Indigenous citizens, have a voice at the table.
About 6 months into his investigation, Police Review Director Jerry McNeely said he was troubled by what he was seeing and hearing in the city.
Because it's a bit of a crisis. That's why I have started and why I'm carrying out this systemic review. We need to bring some reconciliation. We need to bring some changes. We need to bring a better relationship between the police and the Indigenous community and how they interact.
Thunder Bay Police say they're open to any recommendations from the report and that they're already addressing some of the issues. Here's what the new Chief of Police said a few weeks ago after being sworn in.
I can truly tell you, though, that we haven't stood idle for the last year and a half. So it's not like we're sitting waiting to say, okay, please tell us, where we're deficient. efficient. I've really made an effort in the last year and a half to really focus on the areas that were highlighted or that were problematic.
Last winter, the OIPRD found 2 Thunder Bay investigators guilty of discreditable conduct for how they handled Stacey DeBungy's death investigation. The First Nations man's body was found in the McIntyre River in 2015. The complaint filed by his family and community is what prompted the systemic review. The OIPRD says they've reviewed 37 investigations as part of their extensive analysis and review. We will know those findings on December 12 when the report is released. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Thunder Bay.
The government of British Columbia has announced a monumental housing program for Indigenous people across the province. The BC government announced an Indigenous housing fund of $550 million to build 17,050 homes for people on and off reserve. Funding was given to First Nations and organizations across the province. Construction will begin in early 2019.
Hearing from First Nations, hearing from communities that talked about and told stories about overcrowding, hearing stories about housing that was substandard, hearing stories about people who have lived on reserve for their entire life and they're 60 years old and they still don't have a home. That to us as a government was unacceptable. We're committed to reconciliation. We're committed to working in partnership with First Nations. And so we made this commitment to build these homes.
In news from across the border, Democrat Ruth Buffalo made history as the first Native American woman to be sworn into the state's legislature, and she did it in style. Dressed in her traditional regalia, Buffalo was sworn in as a state representative on Monday in Bismarck, North Dakota. Buffalo is from Mandaree. Her mother is Hidatsa Mandan. Her father is Chiricahua Apache. She won in the state's district, which includes Fargo, one of the largest cities. In a shocking turn of events, Buffalo unseated the Republican candidate, one who sponsored a voter ID law, which some feared would suppress the Native American vote in North Dakota. Well, BC First Nations are cashing in on gaming.
That story is coming up after the break, but first, here's tomorrow's weather.
Starting on the east coast, -2 in St. John's, -1 in Halifax. Sunny skies and 10 below for Happy Valley Goose Bay, -9 in Nain, -7 for Chibougamau, 0 in Montreal, +1 in Windsor, Sarnia, and Toronto, -2 in North Bay, -18 under sunny skies in Sioux Lookout, 12 below for Thunder Bay, -21 in Churchill, 18 below and sunny skies for God's Lake. Sunny and -17 for Winnipeg and Gimli. In Saskatchewan, -12 and sunny skies for Saskatoon. -10 in Swift Current. -10 for Uranium City and Buffalo Narrows.
Welcome back. First Nations in British Columbia are about to cash in on that province's gaming industry thanks to a new agreement with the NDP government. APTN's Tina House has the story.
Gaming in BC is worth billions of dollars, and now First Nations will benefit in a huge way.
All 203 nations in British Columbia will have access to a fund that will be stable, long-term funding to help with capacity building, to help with education and health care and infrastructure.
According to Cheryl Cassimer, it's taken 20 years of negotiating with various governments to get here, and says that BC is the last province in the country to share its gaming revenues with First Nations communities.
It's a big deal for all of us here in British Columbia because we have been waiting decades for that to happen.
The announcement came at a recent gathering between First Nations across BC and provincial cabinet ministers.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of our communities are impoverished and lack the resourcing necessary to deal with simple things like, doing some renovations to elders' housing or even fix roads. If you got some big old dirt roads and things like that. And I'm thinking of my community in particular because the roads are just atrocious that go to our houses. And, you know, just to provide elder programming and youth programming.
And one of those youth, 8-year-old Aiden Loring, has an idea on how that money can be spent. At the meeting, he not only grabbed a selfie with the Premier, but had a chance to talk one-on-one with the Premier and BC's Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
I still want to learn more about my culture, language, other stuff like that.
Doesn't mean an expansion of gambling. It just means the monies that we get from lottery tickets and from casinos will be shared with Indigenous communities so that they can build and create the prosperity that they want and all British Columbians will benefit from.
We have a budget in February. We'll know then what the actual quantum is that will be available for First Nations and to be distributed to each and every First Nation in the province.
Blackjack, anyone?
Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
Earlier today on our live edition of APTN in Focus, we discussed Indigenous experiences on college and university campuses and how racism in a variety of forms affects students and staff. Here's what some of the In Focus guests had to say.
If you can't see that there's a wrong being done at the moment it's being done, that is how racism looks. Okay, you have to think about that, okay? Because what ends up happening as an educator, I mean, my expertise is in adult learning theory. That's what I studied.
Right.
But I've never been taught as a teacher how to actually fill that void or to support somebody to move forward. So you have to think of Indigenous-specific racism as one of a panel of events that can occur in an institution, including gender violence, homophobia, ableism, all those kinds of things are linked in a pattern where in fact at the top of the hierarchy in social society are white heterosexual males, as an example. And as we move down, you'd find Indigenous people at the bottom.
I just want to say first too, I'm speaking from my own experience. Other students probably don't have the same experience that I do. But over the past 6 years, I can only describe my experience as nothing short of a nightmare. So in class, it seems like an effort to embrace truth and reconciliation. It's been made more palatable for non-Native students, and particularly white students. And this is Indigenous studies as well. This is not just amongst in other classes like biology or like labor studies or that sort of thing. This is the Indigenous studies department. And so what's been going on with me is the struggle between what Michael Hart was talking about, like systemic racism. So you have a system that promotes individualism. And what that does in our university has Indigenous students fighting one another for positions and to get sort of fame behind their name. And then you also have the dual problem that our classrooms are more about coddling white guilt than being about Indigenous liberation.
You can catch the rest of today's episode along with past episodes at aptnnews.ca. We have to take another break, but there's more news ahead.
And here's the rest of tomorrow's weather forecast. Minus 16 for Peace River, minus 9 under the sun in Grand Prairie, minus 11 in Red Deer, sunny skies, and minus 4 for Calgary. Plus 6 in Tofino, 1 degree cooler in Victoria, minus 13 in Fort Nelson, 12 below for Dease Lake. In the Yukon, minus 15 in Old Crow, minus 17 for Beaver Creek, minus 12 in Norman Wells, 17 below under sunny skies for Fort Liard and Trout Lake, minus 16 with snow in Sax Harbor, snow, and minus 11 for Colville Lake, 30 below for Chesterfield and Whale Cove, minus 31 in Resolute.
Welcome back. Last year, we told you about Edmonton filmmaker Daniel Foreman. He produced a series of short films called Legendary Myths, Raven Adventures, which combine animation with live action. Well, his career just got a big boost because his work was a winner at the American Indian Film Festival. Chris Stewart has the story.
This is my stream and my shaman. Who are you to fish on my territory? I am Nootka, king of Ukulele.
Dan Foreman is busy these days. His creation, Legendary Myths, Raven Adventures, is a hit with audiences and critics. The first season tells Indigenous stories passed down from the Pacific Northwest. It features Raven, a trickster with the power to change the world. Recently, 2 episodes won Best Animation at the American Indian Film Festival in San Francisco. Foreman says the win opened the doors for bigger projects.
We were very fortunate that we won Best Animation, which is, it's a big thing. It actually triggers a telefilm here, and it puts us in the fast track for Talent to Watch program, which basically means we get automatic funding to make our feature film.
His feature film is called The Horned Serpent. This is a darker story. He hopes to have it released by Christmas of 2020.
Hey, handsome. You need a date tonight?
What The Horned Serpent is about is a young boy. He's been raised by his grandmother and his sister's leading a very dark life. She's on the black path, and she ends up being abducted by a serial killer who's hunting Aboriginal women. And her brother has to rescue her, and he becomes a man in the process.
Foreman is hoping to find funding for the second season of Legendary Myths. He says that the first season is now becoming a teaching tool.
Teachers are finding the first season of Legendary Myths, Raven Adventures. They're finding it on their own, and they're actually bringing it into their curriculum, and they're teaching out of it, which is really cool.
And where do you fish at night? I never ask you about your secrets, Raven. I accept and love you the way you are.
My passion is telling stories, and especially I like teaching kids, and I like teaching big kids too. And I learned a ton when I was doing research for the animation series, and I'm going to learn more for this next season. And the more I grow, the more I can help other people grow.
Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
Great work, Dan. Congrats on the award and continued success.
It's beautiful.
That's all the time we have for your news this Wednesday. I'm Dennis Ward.
And if you missed today's In Focus, you can watch on our website, aptnnews.ca/infocus. I'm Melissa Ridgen. Have a good night.